The winter sun was low over the endless plains, painting the dry grass in shades of gold and pale red. A young cowboy named Luke rode his old chestnut horse along the trail, the wind carrying dust around his boots. He had just been hired to work for a cattle ranch not far from the Apache reservation. Life had been quiet and lonely for him since he lost his family in a fever years ago, and he didn't expect anything to change here. He was a man of few words, content with hard work and open skies. But fate had a way of weaving lives together in ways no one could predict. At the edge of the ranch land, near a slow-moving river, was the Apache village. The people there lived with pride, strength, and old traditions. Among them was a young woman named Naya. She was the daughter of the tribe's chief, but unlike others her age, she carried a silent world inside her. She had lost her sight when she was a little girl due to a sickness that swept through her people. Her eyes were still bright and beautiful, but they could no longer see the world she had once known. Because of this, many kept their distance, unsure how to speak to her or act around her. Some even believed she had strange senses, that she could see things others couldn't. The rumors made her lonelier than her blindness ever did. Every morning, Naya would walk to the river with her small stick to guide her. She would sit on a smooth stone, feeling the sunlight on her face and listening to the song of the water. To her, the river was her friend, the one thing that spoke without words. That afternoon, when Luke rode by with his lasso hanging from the saddle, he saw her sitting alone by the river. At first, he didn't know who she was. He only saw a young woman in a plain woven dress, her long black hair moving softly in the breeze. He slowed his horse, thinking she might need help, but before he could say anything, she turned her face toward him. "Who's there?" she asked in a calm voice. "Just a cowboy passing through," he said kindly. "Didn't mean to bother you." "You're not from here," she said, turning her head slightly as if listening to his heartbeat. He smiled awkwardly, wondering how she could tell. "Guess you can say that. I work for the Miller Ranch just west of here." She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the stone. "The wind carries your smell of leather and dust," she said softly. "It tells me you're honest." Her words surprised him. Most people he met didn't speak that way, like every sentence had meaning. Before he could reply, the small charm she was holding slipped from her hand and fell into the shallow river. He saw it float for a moment before sinking near the rocks. "Wait," he said quickly, jumping off his horse. He waded into the cold water, feeling around with his hands until he found the small carved wooden charm. When he handed it to her, she reached out carefully but touched his hand instead. Her fingers rested there for a moment, soft and curious. "You found it," she whispered. "Thank you." "No trouble," he said with a small smile. "Didn't want your keepsake to float away." "It's my mother's," she said quietly. "She gave it to me before she passed." Luke didn't know what to say. He only nodded, and for a long moment they both stood there, the river murmuring between them. She smiled faintly, and that small curve of her lips was something few had seen for a very long time. From that day on, their paths crossed often. Whenever Luke rode near the river to check the fences or herd cattle, he'd see Naya sitting there. Sometimes she was humming softly. Other times she was carving small shapes in the sand with her stick. The first few times he just nodded a greeting, but soon he started stopping to talk. She didn't say much, but when she did, it was always something gentle and thoughtful. He noticed how she listened more than most people ever did, as if she could hear not just his words but his heart too. The nearby townsfolk often stared whenever Luke spoke with her. Some whispered that the chief's daughter was cursed and that any man who grew close to her would be marked by misfortune. Luke didn't care about gossip. He'd seen too much pain in his own life to judge another person by stories. To him, Naya was just a kind soul trapped in darkness but full of quiet strength. One afternoon, while Luke was repairing a broken fence post near the village, a group of young Apache boys came running past him. They were chasing each other and laughing, but when they saw Naya walking slowly by the edge of the trail, they stopped and stared. One boy whispered something that made the others laugh. Luke watched as Naya's face tightened, though she said nothing. She walked past them with her chin high. Luke felt anger rise inside him. "Hey!" he called after the boys. "Show some respect. She's got more courage than the lot of you." The boys froze for a moment, then ran off, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. Luke turned back and saw Naya standing still. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I wanted to." For the first time, she turned her head toward the sound of his voice and smiled, a small, shy smile that touched something deep inside him. Days passed, and a strange comfort grew between them. Sometimes Luke would bring her small things from the town, a smooth stone from the riverbed, a feather he found near the canyon, or a piece of cloth with bright patterns. He would describe the colors and she would touch them carefully, imagining them in her mind. Then, one evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains, a windstorm began to rise. The sky darkened fast and the air filled with dust. Luke was riding back from the west pasture when he heard a faint cry through the roaring wind. His heart skipped. He knew that voice. It was Naya. He jumped off his horse and ran toward the sound, fighting against the heavy gusts. Sand stung his eyes and face. He saw her faint outline through the blur of dust. She was standing dangerously close to the canyon edge, calling for help. The wind had covered her path, and she didn't know how near she was to falling. "Stay still, Naya," he shouted. She turned toward his voice but couldn't tell where he was. "Luke? I can't see where." Before she could finish, he reached her and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back just as a piece of ground crumbled beneath her feet. She gasped, clutching his coat with both hands, shaking as the wind howled around them. For a few moments, neither spoke. All Luke could hear was her breathing and the roar of the storm. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." She buried her face against his chest, her voice trembling. "You came for me." "Of course I did," he replied softly. "I couldn't just let you stand out here." When the storm finally passed, the world was quiet again. The sky opened to reveal a few lonely stars, and the air smelled of rain. Luke helped her back to the camp, holding her hand so she wouldn't stumble. As they walked, she whispered, "No one has ever come for me before." He didn't know what to say, so he just squeezed her hand lightly. She smiled through her tears, knowing that though she could not see his face, she could feel his kindness that night. After she returned to her hut, she sat in silence, holding the charm he had once saved for her. For the first time in many years, her heart felt warm. Somewhere in the darkness, a spark had been lit. And out there under the open stars, the lonely cowboy who thought he'd never belong anywhere didn't realize that he had just changed two lives, hers and his own, forever. After the storm that night, the small Apache village was quiet again. The ground was damp and the wind carried a smell of wet earth. Luke woke early, still thinking about Naya. He couldn't forget the way she had held on to him, her hands trembling as if she was afraid he would disappear. He didn't understand why he cared so much, but something deep inside him wanted to see her again, to make sure she was all right. He rode his horse toward the river, hoping she might be there. And she was. She sat on her usual stone, her stick resting beside her, her dark hair loose over her shoulders. When she heard the sound of hooves, she turned her head slightly and smiled. "You came," she said softly. "Wanted to make sure you were safe," he replied, getting off his horse. "You gave me quite a scare yesterday." She tilted her head. "You sound worried." "I was," he said honestly. "That storm could have taken you right off that edge." She ran her fingers along the smooth stone beside her. "I didn't know where I was," she whispered. "The wind changed everything. I couldn't hear the river anymore, and I lost my way." Luke sat nearby, watching her expression. "Well," he said after a moment, "next time you get lost, just call my name. I'll find you." She turned her face toward the sound of his voice. "You'll come?" He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Always," he said softly. There was a pause, filled with the sound of birds and the gentle rush of water. For a long time they didn't speak, but silence between them never felt empty. It felt calm, like a shared breath. From that day, Luke began visiting Naya more often. Sometimes he brought her small gifts, a piece of smooth amber he found in the dirt or a bright feather from a hawk. He would describe them to her in his slow, thoughtful way. "It's the color of honey," he'd say. Or, "It looks like the sunset when the sky turns red and gold." Naya listened carefully to every word, letting his voice paint pictures in her mind. She told him stories too, old Apache legends her grandmother used to tell before sleep. Stories of spirits that lived in rivers, of brave warriors, and of the stars that were once people who had done great things. Luke listened like a child, sitting cross-legged in the dust, his hat beside him, but not everyone liked what they saw. Some of the tribe's men began to notice how often the cowboy came to the river. They whispered among themselves that it wasn't right for an outsider to speak so freely with the chief's daughter. Others said Naya was cursed and he was foolish to get close to her. Luke ignored the whispers. He had grown up with people who judged anyone different. He knew how it felt to be alone. One afternoon, when Luke was fixing a wagon near the trading post, he saw Naya walking nearby with a basket in her hands. Two women from the village walked past her talking loudly. "She should stay home," one said. "She brings strange luck." The other nodded and moved aside as if Naya carried a disease. Luke's jaw tightened. He stood up and said loudly, "You ladies might want to look at your own hearts before calling someone unlucky." The women froze, glared at him, and walked away quickly. Naya stood still, her head slightly lowered. When he reached her, she said quietly, "You shouldn't have spoken for me. It'll only make them angry." "I don't care," he said firmly. "They don't know you like I do." Her lips curved into a small smile. "You sound like a stubborn man," he chuckled. "Maybe I am, but I mean every word." She lifted her face toward him, her eyes unfocused but full of life. "Then thank you," she whispered. "No one has stood for me in a long time." That evening, Luke walked her back to her father's lodge. The chief, an old man with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood outside watching. His face was unreadable. Luke tipped his hat politely, but the chief didn't respond. Naya greeted her father and went inside, while Luke quietly turned away. He could feel the chief's gaze on his back all the way down the path. The next morning, word spread quickly that the chief had spoken to his council about the cowboy's visits. Some wanted him gone. "He doesn't belong among us," one said. "He is changing the girl's heart." But the chief said nothing yet. He only watched and waited. Meanwhile, Luke went on with his work as usual. But he found himself glancing toward the village every evening, wondering if Naya was all right. He missed their talks, her calm voice, and the way she could make silence feel like music. Finally, one night he couldn't resist. He saddled his horse and rode quietly toward the river. She was there, waiting. "You came late," she said softly as he approached. "Had to finish up the herd," he replied, smiling. "Didn't think you'd still be out." "I always wait," she said. "The river tells me when you're near." He laughed gently. "The river must know me well by now." "It does," she said. "It says your heart is kind but heavy." He looked at her in surprise. "What makes you say that?" "Because your words carry sadness," she said. "You sound like someone who has lost more than he speaks about." Luke didn't answer right away. He looked at the moonlight shining on the water. "I lost my family when I was young," he said quietly. "They got sick. I buried them myself out in Texas before I came here. Since then, it's just been me and this horse." Naya's expression softened. "Then maybe the wind brought you here for a reason." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it did." The sound of an owl echoed across the valley, soft and lonely. Naya lifted her head, listening. "Do you ever get tired of being alone, Luke?" she asked. "Every day," he admitted, "but I never said it out loud before." She turned toward him, reaching out her hand slowly. He hesitated for a moment, then took it. Her fingers were warm and small in his rough palm. "You're not alone now," she said simply. That one sentence broke something open inside him. All the walls he had built around his heart began to fall. He looked at her, this blind girl who saw the world better than anyone, and realized he had found something precious, something real. For weeks after that, they met often by the river, sometimes in secret. He would tell her stories about the open plains, about how the stars looked when you rode at night. She loved those stories most. "When you talk about stars," she said one evening, "I can almost see them, like small fires that never go out." And every time she said that, he wished she truly could see them. But peace never lasts long in such places. One day, as Luke was leaving the river, he heard angry voices behind him. Two Apache warriors stood blocking his path. One of them, a tall man named Kato, was known to be proud and loyal to the chief. "You have no right to speak with her," Kato said coldly. "She belongs to her people, not to a stranger." Luke stayed calm. "I never meant harm. I just treat her like anyone should, with respect." Kato stepped closer. "Then respect her enough to stay away. You are not one of us." Luke looked him straight in the eye. "Maybe not. But I don't see tribes or borders when someone needs a friend." The men glared at him but said nothing more. They walked away, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. Luke stood there for a long moment, feeling both angry and sad. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he also couldn't turn his back on Naya. That night, Naya sensed something had changed. When Luke didn't come, she sat by the river and waited. Hours passed and still he didn't appear. She began to hum softly, her song floating through the night air, a song of longing, of hope, of a bond that no one else understood. Far away, Luke sat alone under the stars, staring into the fire. He told himself it would be easier to stop seeing her, to let things fade before they grew harder. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was her smile, her voice calling his name through the storm, her hands reaching for his. He sighed deeply and whispered into the wind, "I can't let her face this world alone." And so, before the dawn came, he made a quiet promise to himself that no matter what others said, he would stand by her. Because what they shared wasn't wrong. It was rare, fragile, and honest. And in the heart of that lonely cowboy, something had begun to grow, something stronger than fear and deeper than words. The sun was high over the plains when Luke finally returned to the river after days of staying away. His heart had been heavy during those days. He had tried to keep his distance, telling himself it was the right thing to do. But he couldn't forget Naya's voice, her laughter, and the peace he felt whenever she was near. Every night he looked at the stars and thought about her sitting alone by the water, waiting. That thought broke his heart. When he reached the river, he saw her sitting quietly, tracing lines in the sand with her stick. She looked tired but calm. She didn't turn when he approached. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. Luke stopped in his tracks. "How?" She smiled faintly. "Because the wind changed. It always smells different when you're near." He walked closer, his boots crunching lightly on the ground. "I'm sorry I stayed away," he said quietly. "Didn't want to cause you more trouble." Her face turned toward him, her eyes gentle. "You don't cause trouble, Luke. People do that to themselves. They fear what they don't understand." He sat beside her, his hat resting in his lap. "Your people think I'm wrong for being near you." "My people are good," she said softly. "But they protect me too much. They think blindness makes me weak. They forget I still have a heart." Luke nodded slowly. "Maybe they're afraid you'll get hurt." She lifted her chin. "Then they don't know me at all. I've been hurt before. What scares me isn't pain, it's being forgotten." Her words hit Luke deeply. He looked at her, realizing how lonely her world truly was. She didn't just live in darkness, she lived apart from everyone, hidden by walls built out of fear and pity. He wanted to say something to comfort her, but she began speaking again, her voice calm and thoughtful. "When I was little," she said, "I could see. I remember colors. My mother's dress was red and my father's feathers were white and brown. I used to chase butterflies near this same river." "What happened?" Luke asked softly. "A sickness came," she replied. "Many got ill. I survived, but when I woke one morning, I couldn't see anymore. The light was gone. I cried for days, but my father told me the Great Spirit took my sight to give me something else instead. Understanding. But I would have traded all the understanding in the world to see one sunrise again." Her voice trembled for a moment, and Luke gently placed his hand over hers. "You may not see the sunrise, Naya," he said quietly, "but you make others feel it. I've seen the way the world changes when you smile." She turned her face toward him, a faint blush warming her cheeks. "You talk like a poet, Cowboy." He laughed softly. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." They both laughed then, the kind of easy laughter that melts the distance between two hearts. From that day on, they met every evening. Luke taught her to recognize things by touch. He'd place objects in her hand, a smooth stone, a pine cone, a horseshoe, and describe them. She'd run her fingers across each item, listening to his voice as if it painted colors in her mind. One evening, he took her hand and placed it on his horse's mane. "This is Thunder," he said. "He's got a scar on his leg from when he tried to race a train." She laughed. "You're lying, I swear," he said with a grin. He thought he could beat it. "The train won." She stroked the horse's mane, giggling.
"He feels strong."
"I can tell he trusts you." "He's smarter than me," Luke said jokingly. "He knows good people when he meets them." As the days passed, their bond grew deeper. Luke found peace in her quiet strength. She never complained about her blindness, never asked for pity. Instead, she showed him how to see the world in new ways through sound, touch, and feeling. He learned that the chirp of a bird, the rustle of leaves, or the rhythm of footsteps could be as beautiful as any sight. But not everyone saw beauty in their friendship. One afternoon, Luke overheard two tribesmen talking outside the trading post. "The cowboy visits her again," one said. He'll bring shame to the chief's family. The other spat on the ground. Maybe the chief will finally send him away. Luke tried to ignore it, but the words cut deep. That night when he went to see Naya, he seemed quieter than usual. She sensed it instantly. "You're worried," she said. "Your voice is heavy." He looked at the stars and sighed. "Your people don't trust me." "They will," she said calmly. He shook his head. "No, I'm an outsider. I work for a ranch. They see me as nothing more than a wanderer." Naya reached out and touched his arm gently. "Then let me be your eyes and you be my strength. Together we can face what they fear." He looked at her, speechless for a moment. No one had ever spoken to him like that. She wasn't just brave, she was wise, and she believed in him more than he believed in himself. Later that week, her father, the chief, called a gathering near the fire. Luke didn't attend, but he heard about it the next day. The chief had warned his people to keep distance from strangers, especially those who might confuse the chief's daughter. Naya listened in silence but said nothing. She respected her father, yet she also knew her own heart. When the meeting ended, she slipped away quietly and found Luke waiting near the river. He looked worried. "I heard what your father said," he told her. "I know," she said softly. "He wants to protect me. He doesn't understand that you've already done that." Luke frowned. "I don't want to cause trouble between you and him." "You haven't," she said. "You've given me something no one else did. Freedom." He tilted his head. "Freedom?" She nodded slowly. "When I'm with you, I forget I'm blind. You make me feel like the world is wide again." Her words filled him with warmth and guilt at the same time. He wanted to keep her safe but feared that being close to him might bring her more pain. The next day, when he came to see her again, the chief himself was waiting. The old man stood tall, his eyes sharp and serious. "Cowboy," he said, "I know you mean no harm, but my daughter belongs to this land, to her people. She has her path. You have yours." Luke nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. I understand." The chief studied him for a long moment. "You have saved her twice. For that I owe you my respect. But do not forget, some things are not meant to be joined." Luke wanted to speak, but the chief turned and walked away. When Naya found out, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "My father fears losing me. He thinks your kindness will take me from him, but he doesn't know that kindness can bring people together." Luke sighed. "I just don't want to make things harder for you." "You won't," she said, her voice steady. "I trust you." That night they sat by the river again. Luke began describing the stars even though she couldn't see them. "There's one bright one," he said, pointing to the sky. "It's right above us. Looks like it's keeping watch." "Tell me what it looks like," she whispered. "It's like a small fire burning in the dark," he said softly. "It flickers, but it never dies," she smiled. "Then that's how I'll think of you, Luke, like a fire that never fades." He looked at her, and for a long moment the world around them disappeared. He didn't care what anyone thought. All he knew was that this girl, this blind daughter of the Apache chief, had somehow seen straight into his soul. As the night deepened, the wind grew cooler, and the sound of the river filled the silence. Luke finally said, "Whatever happens, I'll be here. Naya, you don't have to face the darkness alone." She turned her face toward him and whispered, "I never have, not since you came." And though neither of them said the word aloud, they both knew what had begun between them was something real, something that even blindness couldn't hide and even fear couldn't destroy. The following days brought silence to the village. The chief had spoken his warning clearly, and the people obeyed. Some avoided talking about the cowboy. Others watched from a distance whenever he rode near, but even the whispers could not keep Luke away for long. His heart had already chosen its path, and Naya, though she lived in darkness, could feel that his footsteps carried truth. That evening, as the sun dropped low behind the hills, Luke rode quietly toward the river. The golden light made everything glow soft and warm. He saw Naya sitting there, her hair moving with the wind, her face lifted toward the sound of rushing water. For a long moment he just watched her, wondering how someone who couldn't see could still look so peaceful. She heard the gentle sound of his horse and smiled. "You came again?" she said. "Couldn't stay away," he replied, getting off and sitting beside her. "It feels wrong when the day ends and I haven't seen you." She turned her head slightly, her smile deepening. "Even though I cannot see you, I know when you're near. It's strange, everything feels lighter when you're close." Luke took off his hat and rubbed his hands together nervously. Your father won't like that, she sighed softly. My father loves me. He just wants to keep me safe. He doesn't understand that safety and happiness are not always the same thing. The sound of her words lingered between them like a soft wind. Luke wanted to tell her that she made him happier than he had been in years. He wanted to say that the world felt right when she was around. But before he could speak, distant shouting came from the direction of the village. It was followed by the sound of hooves, wild, sharp, and uneven. Luke stood up at once, his eyes narrowing toward the noise. Something's wrong, he said quickly. Naya stood too, holding her stick tightly. What's happening? I don't know, Luke said. But before he could answer, a horse came galloping out of the dust, its reins dragging. It was one of the village horses. It looked terrified. Without thinking, Luke ran toward it, trying to calm it down, but the animal reared and bolted through the camp. The shouts grew louder. Smoke began to rise from one of the huts. A lantern had fallen and the dry grass had caught fire. People were rushing to put it out, but panic made everything worse. Luke grabbed a bucket and ran toward the flames with several others. He didn't think about being an outsider. He didn't think about what anyone would say. All he cared about was helping. He worked fast, throwing water, shouting directions, his face covered in sweat and ash. When the flames finally began to die down, he heard someone scream, Naya's name. His heart jumped. He dropped the bucket and ran. Naya had wandered too close to the burning area, following the sound of frightened children trying to help them find their way out. She couldn't see the danger. A frightened horse had broken free near her and was charging in blind panic, its hooves pounding the ground. Luke didn't think twice. He sprinted across the smoke and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away just as the horse thundered past. They both fell hard into the dirt, the sound of the animal fading behind them. When the dust settled, Naya was lying in his arms, trembling. Luke, she whispered. I'm here, he said, his breath heavy. You're safe. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she slowly reached up and touched his face. You always come when I need you, she said softly. He smiled faintly. Guess that's my habit now. By the time the fire was out, the village was quiet again. People gathered around, whispering and pointing toward the cowboy holding the chief's daughter. The chief himself arrived, his face lined with worry. When he saw Luke's arms around Naya, something inside him shifted. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at the man who had risked everything to protect his child. Again. Naya slowly stood, her hand still resting on Luke's arm. He saved me, Father, she said quietly. The chief's eyes softened. I can see that. He stepped closer to Luke. You have courage, the chief said finally. But courage without wisdom can destroy. Tell me, cowboy, why do you stay near her when you know it brings you trouble? Luke took a breath, meeting his eyes. Because she makes me remember what being alive feels like. She listens like no one else does, and I'd rather face trouble beside her than live safely without her. The crowd murmured at his words. The chief studied him for a long time, then nodded slowly. You speak with heart, not pride. Maybe that is why the spirits have spared you more than once. He placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. But if you stay near her, you must learn patience. The path of two hearts is not built in a day. Luke nodded. I'll learn. From that evening on, things began to change slowly. The people who once whispered about the cowboy started to see him differently. They remembered how he ran into fire without thinking, how he helped their children. Even those who still doubted began to watch him with quiet respect. Naya, too, seemed lighter. She laughed more often and began walking around the camp with confidence. Luke sometimes guided her hand to help her find her way. But more and more she learned to move by the sound of his footsteps alone. One afternoon, while Luke repaired the corral fence, Naya came and sat nearby. She listened to the sound of the hammer striking wood. You work too much, she teased. He smiled. Keeps my hands busy. Otherwise I start thinking too much. What do you think about? He looked at her with a small smile. You mostly. She blushed slightly, her cheeks warm in the sunlight. Then maybe you should stop before you wear yourself out. He laughed softly. Not a chance. As the days passed, Luke became part of the rhythm of the village. Children came to watch him fix saddles or tell stories. The women who once avoided Naya now smiled when they passed her. It was as if a heavy fog had lifted from the place. But one evening, as the sun sank and the air turned cool, Luke found himself sitting with the chief by the fire. The old man smoked his pipe in silence for a while before speaking. "You have done much for my people," he said slowly. "But I must ask, what do you truly want, Cowboy?" Luke thought for a long moment. "I just want to belong somewhere again," he said finally. "And maybe to keep her safe." The chief nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Safety is not given, Luke. It's earned through loyalty and love. If you mean what you say, then stay through the winter. Help my people. Let them see who you truly are." Luke agreed without hesitation. "I'll stay." When he told Naya later, she smiled softly. "You're not afraid of the long winter?" He shook his head. "Not if I can spend it here with you." She reached for his hand and held it tightly. "Then the winter will be warm," she whispered. That night the stars above the valley burned brighter than ever. The village was quiet, peaceful. Luke lay awake listening to the sound of distant drums and the whisper of the wind through the grass. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a wanderer. He felt like he belonged to a place, to a people, and most of all, to a heart that could not see him but understood him better than anyone ever had. He smiled in the dark, thinking of her words, "When you're near, everything feels lighter." He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't know if her father would ever truly accept him, or if the world would allow what they were becoming. But one thing he knew for sure: whatever storm came next, he would stand beside her, just like before. Because in a world full of people who refused to look past what they could see, he had found someone who saw him without eyes, and that, he thought, was the rarest kind of love there could ever be. Winter came slowly to the plains. The days grew shorter, and the wind carried a chill that crept into every cabin and tent. But even in the cold, Luke stayed near the village. He helped repair fences, gathered firewood, and fixed tools for anyone who asked. Over time, the people began to trust him completely. They saw how he worked without complaint, how he treated everyone with respect, and how he always made time to guide Naya whenever she wanted to walk near the river. For Naya, this winter felt different. In the past, winters had been lonely. The darkness around her always felt deeper when the world grew quiet. But now she had Luke. His voice had become her warmth, his footsteps her guide. She could tell his mood just by the sound of how he walked. Soft when he was calm, heavier when he was worried. She had learned to read the world through him. One cold evening, she stood outside her father's lodge, wrapped in a thick blanket. The sky was full of stars she couldn't see, but she could feel their stillness above. Luke approached, his boots crunching on the frost. "It's colder tonight," he said softly. "I don't mind," she replied. "The wind sounds gentle," he smiled. "You always find peace in everything, don't you?" She turned toward him. "When you can't see, peace is something you have to find inside yourself." He looked at her for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold air. "I think you found mine too," he said quietly. Her cheeks warmed at his words, though she didn't answer. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the faint crackle of the village fires. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Later that night, the chief called Luke into his lodge. The firelight flickered across the old man's face as he looked up. "You've stayed through the cold," he said slowly. "You've worked hard. My people speak well of you now." Luke nodded. "I just did what anyone should." The chief studied him for a moment. "No, you did more. You've given my daughter laughter again. For that I owe you gratitude." Luke hesitated. "She gave me something too, hope. I thought I'd lost it long ago." The chief's eyes softened. "Hope is a powerful thing. But tell me, Luke, what will you do when spring comes? Will you leave or will you stay?" Luke took a deep breath. "If she'll have me, I'll stay." The chief leaned back in silence. He could see the honesty in Luke's eyes. After a long pause, he said, "You're a good man. The spirits seem to favor you. But know this, the path you've chosen will not be easy. The world beyond our valley will not understand." Luke nodded. "The world never understood much of what matters. But I'll walk whatever path she walks, no matter how far it goes." The chief smiled faintly, a rare thing for him. Then let the spirits decide the rest. When Luke stepped outside, Naya was waiting near the fire, her head tilted slightly as if listening for him. "He talked to you, didn't he?" she asked. "Yes," Luke said. "He asked what I'll do when spring comes." "And what did you say?" He smiled softly. "That I'll stay as long as you want me to." Her lips trembled, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then she reached out her hand, finding his. Then I'll ask the spirits to keep you here." He held her hand gently, feeling her warmth in the cold night. "I don't think I'll need their help," he said. "You've already done that." As the weeks passed, the snow began to melt. The rivers ran faster and green returned to the valley. The village prepared for the spring ceremony, a time to honor new life and give thanks for what survived the winter. People cleaned their homes, painted new symbols on the poles, and gathered wood for the large central fire that would burn through the night. On the morning of the ceremony, Naya sat outside listening to the preparations. Children laughed nearby and the air smelled of herbs and smoke. Luke was helping the men raise the tall wooden totem that would stand near the fire. He worked with quiet focus, his hands steady. When he finished, he looked toward Naya and saw her smiling faintly in the sunlight. He felt something swell in his chest, a quiet joy he had never known before. That evening, when the fire was lit and the drums began to beat, Luke stood beside her. The rhythm echoed across the valley. The people danced in circles, their movements graceful and full of life. Naya listened to the sound, her head moving slightly to follow the pattern of the drums. "What does it look like?" she asked. Luke thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. "It looks like the fire itself is alive," he said softly. "The flames dance like your people reaching up to the stars." She smiled. "Then I can see it." The chief rose and began to speak in his native tongue. His voice was strong and deep. When he finished, he turned toward Luke and Naya. "This night," he said, "we give thanks for the light that returns after darkness. The spirits remind us that even the blind can guide and even the lost can be found." Everyone bowed their heads. Naya reached for Luke's hand and whispered, "He spoke of us." Luke nodded, his eyes warm. "Yes, he did." As the fire burned high, the chief motioned for them to step closer. He placed his hand on Naya's shoulder. "My daughter," he said, "you have walked through darkness with courage. You have found someone who walks beside you without fear. That is a gift few receive." Then he turned to Luke. "Cowboy, you came as a stranger, but tonight I call you friend." "You are welcome among us," the crowd murmured in approval. Luke bowed his head deeply, feeling an ache of emotion rise in his chest. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means more than I can say." Later, when the fire burned low and the stars spread wide across the sky, Luke and Naya sat by the river together. The air was cool and full of the sound of crickets. "Do you ever wish you could see again?" Luke asked gently. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But then I think, if I could see, maybe I wouldn't have listened as deeply. Maybe I wouldn't have found you." He looked at her with quiet wonder. "You've got a way of turning everything into something beautiful." She laughed softly. "You just see it that way." He reached for her hand, holding it between his own. "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "You taught me how." The moonlight touched the river, making it shimmer like silver. Naya leaned closer, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "Do you think the spirits planned this?" she whispered. Luke looked at the water, thinking of everything that had brought them here. The storm, the fire, the fear, and the courage that had bound their paths together. "Maybe they did," he said quietly. "Or maybe it was just two hearts finding each other in the dark." She smiled softly. "Then I'm glad the dark led me to you." They sat there in silence for a long while, the sound of the water flowing steady and calm beside them. In the distance, the village fire burned low, casting warm light across the plains. The wind carried the scent of smoke and earth, the smell of home. Luke glanced toward Naya, her face peaceful, her blind eyes lifted toward the night sky. "You know," he said gently, "you once told me you wanted to see one sunrise again." She nodded. "Yes, I remember," he smiled. "Then tomorrow morning I'll describe it for you. The way the colors move, how the world changes. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel it the way I do." She turned her face toward him, her lips forming a soft smile. "I already do," she whispered. And as dawn approached, painting the horizon with light, Luke realized something he'd never understood before. That sometimes the truest kind of sight isn't found in the eyes at all, but in the heart that learns to see love even through darkness. The blind daughter of the Apache chief and the cowboy who once wandered without purpose had found each other by accident. But what they built, through patience, kindness, and courage, was no accident at all. It was destiny written not in stars, but in the quiet bond between two souls who had finally learned to see.